they would have to do something about their availability and sustainability of forces for the future before they could even contemplate that. Putin does still seek to roll that back. That is his grand strategic objective. The Thunder Run, where the war was supposed to be over between 3 and 5 days, is now this very glacial walk, and even worse than that, if in terms of the map, the red arrows are not going forward. The Russian people are now being shown the vulnerability of the population to the increased range and accuracy of the Ukrainian strikes.
So Chip, thank you for joining me today. Satellite imagery shows Vladimir Putin is expanding military bases along Russia's borders with NATO countries, with the amount of troops increasing up to 115,000. Where exactly are these bases and how worrying is this?
Well, I don't think we should worry about it in the very short term, because from a NATO perspective, the first time that they say that Russia could be in a position to attack any NATO country would be 2030. But that itself is a great variable, of course, depending on what happens in Ukraine in the next 1, 2 or 3 years, or if there is a settlement in Ukraine in the next 1, 2 or 3 years, and if Vladimir Putin and his regime are still in track. But it's worth saying in relation to that as at yesterday, we were at day 1,569 days of the Ukraine-Russia war, which is now longer than the First World War. So bearing in mind that the Thunder Run has now become a glacial walk, they may not have the capability. But to now directly answer your question, we're seeing evidence from satellite imagery of Russian bases being built, certainly on the border, the 810-mile border with Finland. Now, Finland and Sweden, of course, became the 31st and 32nd members of NATO as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. If you go back to pre-2022 days, the percentage of people in both Sweden and Finland who were favourable to NATO membership was actually in the low teens. It was Russia's actions which propelled that into a position where both joined in 2023. That gave a 810-mile border between the new NATO member of Finland and Russia. It is that border which we're seeing this satellite evidence of new bases being built, particularly for the 44th Army Corps. Should we be too worried? Not that worried. It is the bases that have been identified are somewhere between 150, 175 kilometres from the border. And this would make sense from a planning perspective for the future in terms of the Western Military District, which is the district which now will abut Finland. The Western Military District is certainly at the moment, from a Russian perspective, an economy of effort arc, really. The key military district of the Russians for the present is the Southern Military District. That is the one which confronts the bulk of the Ukrainian forces in that sphere of influence. It is also worth saying, of course, that the Western Military District, its headquarters is in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg has been hit in the last couple of weeks by the Ukrainians, and indeed would be held at risk were there to be any incursion in the future by Russia into Finland. Now, Finland does have a long history with Russia. The Winter War of 1939 to 1940 led to the loss of 9% of the Finnish territory, and that is why the Finnish people absolutely understand about security and security resilience in the way, for example, that British people probably don't at the moment. They do, and that is why it's a kind of large citizen army which can mobilise quickly, including its reserve for the future. So should we be worried at the moment? No, we shouldn't. And indeed, the fact that satellite imagery has picked it up is indicative that in any potential future incursions, we'd have indicators and warnings. That's indeed what the Americans had through satellite and other forms of intelligence prior to the Russian invasion in 2022. They knew what the Russians were up to, and that's why, for example, Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, went to Russia, to Moscow, prior to February to tell them that we knew what they were up to. We would certainly know that in the future.
If we look at the distances here from Crimea all the way to the northwestern part of Russia where the new base has been developed, that's over 1,200 miles. Can Russia even supply and sustain this new base?
Well, they're different lines of communication, so I don't think you should look at the Crimea to sort of Western Military District in that sense. You look at the internal and external lines of operation and communication, as we call them. But the line of communication which would be more pertinent to talk about would be the line of communication which sustains or increasingly doesn't sustain the operations in Crimea, because it is now the case that the rear area has become the front area for the Russians, both in terms of the deep strikes by the Ukrainians, but also because of this notion that Ukraine now has fire control over the Novorossiysk highway, that is from Rostov-on-Don all the way through to Crimea. That is being cut by the Ukrainians. So like all these things in war, we talk about three things which are really important: logistics, logistics and logistics. And if you can interdict routes to either resupply an army or, in the case of Crimea, to supply the population, you've got a big problem. And for Russia, with this fire control of the Ukrainians, that is a compounding problem for Russia in that southern military district. So if you were to have a major world war, because an involvement of both the southern military district and the western military district would be of a scale which would make it so, then they would have to do something about their availability and sustainability of forces for the future before they could even contemplate that. And that would need a major regeneration and reconstitution program, which currently the Russians would not be able to achieve.
There's also been another batch of satellite imagery analysis, this time by an open source intelligence expert called Jompy. It proves that out of over 2,000 tanks left in Russian reserves, only about 851 are actually combat capable, so 42%. What's your assessment of the Russian war machine? Is it strong enough to attack NATO?
No, it's not. But you have to then split the different component parts of NATO apart, I think, to look at what things are achievable. And of course, you would need a unified NATO to stop the Russians doing anything, and that is either deterrence by denial being there or deterrence by punishment. And you would need to do that with no hesitation. Now, there are parts of NATO where there absolutely would be no hesitation in responding to any Russian aggression. That is particularly in the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, and of course Finland, Sweden, if there was any conflict in the Gulf of Finland or around there. There might be hesitation from other countries though. So it's whether the Russians could achieve or try to achieve some of their strategic objectives, which do include, for example, degrading and breaking apart NATO in the same way that they wish to degrade and break apart the EU. That is still one of their informational objectives in the next 5 years, and that is why they use, for example, from St. Petersburg, a number of cyber bots for use in the social media sphere to amplify their messages or to crowd out the messages of potentially sane actors. So they could break people apart, and some people would argue that that's exactly what they've done, with the fact that America has been pretty lukewarm on supporting Ukraine, and with the America First and MAGA doctrine in the United States at the moment. All those countries in the Baltics and Finland, as I said, would respond to any Russian threat. There were some war games a few years ago, about 10 years ago, which showed that on a very bad day, that the Russians could be in Riga and Tallinn within 60 hours. But from 2016 to today, you'd ask yourself, has the situation changed? And the situation has changed for at least two reasons. Firstly, because of the growth in defence budgets and the defence stance of those Baltic countries, along with the Poles. And secondly, because NATO went from a posture of reassurance to forward presence. That is why, for example, we have the enhanced forward presence battle groups and brigades now forward in those Baltic countries, which includes, of course, a British battle group with other multinational elements in Estonia, based at Tapa base in Estonia.
Recent drone incursions into the Baltic states have caused massive panic. Ukraine says these drones are veering off course because of intense Russian electronic jamming. How dangerous is this invisible electronic warfare?
Well, I think we have to always keep these things in sort of context and not get too jumpy about them from this perspective. There have been a number of times since February 2022 when some people have said Article 5 should be implemented, we're going to be at war with Russia, of which the first example was when there was an attack close to the Polish border at the what was the PFP base, close to the border but not over the border. There were drone incursions in early 22 across the Polish border. Airspace is sovereign under the Chicago Declaration, but just because a drone or a series of drones veers off for electronic warfare reasons or other reasons, because it could be that that is the route which has been programmed in, does not mean that you will go directly to World War III. You would, under the NATO Charter, consult under Article 4 before you even did anything, which would suggest that. However, they are incursions, they need to be taken seriously, and like all these things, you're looking for patterns and trends to see what this means in terms of, is it something which is just a misdirection, or is it something which is building a pattern which leads to a pattern of activity where you need to take action against that sort of malign hybrid warfare activity, because it would build into something which would cascade if you do not do so. At the moment, I think we've done it in a proportionate sense in responding to any types of drone incursions that we've seen on the border. That is a sensible way to do it at the moment in the posture that we've adopted.
Russia has claimed to have information that Ukraine planned to launch military drones from Latvia. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Russia's military was preparing for an appropriate response. Is this all another bluff from Russia?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely disinformation from Russia. Again, it could be building a pattern of activity from then. One of the things that the Russians do seek to do, of course, is that there are Russian speakers in each of those Baltic countries. They are part of what the Russians believe to be the Russian world, Ruski Mir, and that they are therefore Russian citizens, and if things go pear-shaped, that they should come to their assistance. That is one of those times when you would look for that as a provocation from the Russians. And I think this is building from the Russians a pattern for the future again, where they might say that these types of things are provocation should that happen. I think the chances of Latvia or any of the Baltic countries at the moment allowing their airspace or land space to be used for the launching of drones is about nil. It just won't happen, because that is not the way it would do business. There's a particular reason that Ukraine wasn't allowed to join NATO, because it therefore would put NATO at risk, would have been a member for collective warfare, collective action, and so the chances of that, as I said, are very, very remote. It's disinformation.
There seems to be a sense that the war in Ukraine is spilling over and getting closer. Is this exactly what Putin wants, to sow fear?
Well, yeah, I mean, part of his hybrid warfare objectives, or grand strategic objectives, is to regain lost territory and spheres of influence. He still has that as his prime directive whilst he is in power. He will try and achieve that initially by breaking apart the cohesion of NATO in those societies that he abuts. And indeed, if we go back to our original conversation, it was the Finlandization that happened after the 39-40 Winter War, which was precisely why Central and Eastern Europe were afraid of of Russia when the Soviet Union broke apart. That is why they readily joined NATO under Article 10. Putin does still seek to roll that back. That is his grand strategic objective. That is why the best way to prevent Russia doing that is to support Ukraine in any overt way possible so that you can defeat Russia. And I don't mean that in any other way than the military verb definition, which is to render your enemy incapable of achieving his objectives. One of the weaknesses for the Russians at the moment is they've not been able to achieve any mass in Ukraine. They're not willing to go to a mass mobilization which might allow them to achieve any operational or strategic result because of the fractures that might lead to in civil society, where conditions are getting worse for them. The sanctuary of the Russian people is being eroded on a daily basis by the far-reaching nature and increasing distance that Ukrainian drones can go.
In his resignation letter, the UK's Defence Secretary John Healey said that Russia might attack as soon as 2030, which you mentioned earlier. Is the UK and its European allies ready for war with Russia?
Well, they're ready in a deterrence posture, but I think we have to be very, very careful about complacency. And that is why I think Healey's resignation was a very principled thing to do from a decent man. And what he really said as his top line, I think, is that the settlement that he was being offered was inadequate and needed to be challenged for our international commitments, including the drive to go towards 3% of GDP for defence by 2030, and ultimately the forward NATO goal of 5% by 2035. The whole thing about this is it's far cheaper not to fight a war than it is to fight a war, because, for example, I think in the Second World War about 43% of GDP was posited towards that. The problem for the Brits at the moment, and I think this is where the letter by Minister of the Armed Forces Al Cairns comes in, is that, and also of course that was the 7th ministerial resignation in the last few months, is that linking that with your previous point about the few remaining stocks of Soviet era tanks, including T-54, 55s, T-62, 64, which probably have no relevance on the modern battlefield because of the old nature of those models. They've always been kept outdoors, not in a climate-controlled environment, as our sort of reserve tanks are, for example. And what Al Cairns said in his resignation letter was that the character of conflict is changing faster than our procurement can keep up. And it's that sword versus shield, which is always the dilemma about how do you structure your forces for the future and what is the real future of warfare. At the moment, today, it looks like drones. That doesn't mean that will be the case in 10 years' time. That is always the dilemma when you're trying to look at your military budgets for the future. John Healey obviously thought that he wasn't getting what he needed and things were going to be inadequate. This leads to what we call the rhetoric-reality gap. The rhetoric-reality gap has been there for a few years, and it just needs to be closed. What it's really shown is that the Strategic Defence Review was not a plan, it was an unfunded aspiration. And the key thing is always what Colin Powell used to say: show me your budget and I'll show you your strategy. A strategy without a budget is nothing.
Just looping that all back to these Russian bases that are being constructed, are they not just sitting ducks now? A base just seems so vulnerable when we look in Ukraine, those deep strikes, the Flamingo missile. What's the future in that?
That's a really interesting question. Any base, of course, General Mattis always used to say that force protection is a responsibility, not a mission. Any force, anywhere, in geographical terms, should always be protected. That's a first order given. The problem at the moment, because of that transparent battlefield and because of precision strike, is how do you overcome that? That is where we look back once more to the sword versus shield, drone, anti-drone warfare, lasers, directed energy weapons. All that will be in the mix as which one predominates for the future. That is where innovation and the defence industrial base and the speed of change comes about, both in intellectual and conceptual terms.
230 drone wave, blowing up major oil refineries and forcing Moscow to cancel its Red Square Russia Day concert for the first time in 23 years. How much of a psychological and political humiliation is that for Putin?
Well, I think it is, but I think it's really playing more or as much into the fact that Russian people are now being shown the vulnerability of the population to the increased range and accuracy of the Ukrainian strikes. Again, it leads back into this notion that the Thunder Run, where the war was supposed to be over between 3 and 5 days, is now this very glacial walk, and even worse than that, if in terms of the map, the red arrows are not going forward. Russia only took 41 square kilometres, according to the Institute for the Study of War, between December 25 and May 26, and actually lost 281 square kilometres in May. So there's been a net decline in the amount of occupied territory in the last 6 months. That is not a pathway to success and war winning. That is why I think you play into the notion of the meaning of Zelenskyy's letter, open letter to Putin, at the same time that you had the economic forum in St. Petersburg. That really had a number of aspects to it. The first one, I think, was it was a brilliant strategic comms initiative from Zelenskyy, which did show that they can use, that they're in a position of initiative and confidence, and that there's only one blocker to peace, that is Russia. The audiences are not just the Russian elites, they're the international audience, and actually to Trump, because it seems to be that, you know, Ukraine does have cards and they're playing them very well. I think Zelensky's been a master of this throughout the conflict. You know, it's that thing I said many years ago when he came to the Houses of Commons to speak, that rather like Churchill, he unleashed the English language and sent it into battle. That is what Zelenskyy has been doing with his strategic comms, because informational warfare, psychological warfare, is just as much a part of warfare as the physical fighting.
So we're seeing reports that 70% of the Russian population is now inside the strike range of Ukrainian drones. And as you mentioned, Russia is losing ground. It's just recorded its second consecutive month of losing more territory than it gained in Ukraine. When you look at, when you saw a puffy-faced, spluttering Putin at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, do you think Zelenskyy smells blood?
That is for the Russian people, obviously, to determine ultimately. But if he can exacerbate the incipient fractures, then he will do so. Again, I've said over a number of times over the last 4 years that we look at the Clausewitzian Trinity, and there's 3 parts of a triangle, and if all of them are not in sync or one falls apart, then your ability to wage war is gone. And in Russia's terms, that is either elite defections, or the army simply defect off the battlefield in the same way they did near the end of the First World War, leading to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, or the people revolt. Now, having 70% of the people now in range, when indeed they seem to be protected from that, it was always the case for the people under Putin that if you stay out of politics and political dialogue, I will look after you. If that is now being eroded, that may no longer pertain. But again, knowing when that erosion becomes a landslide is always very difficult to do, because one fact about war is always consistent, that there are still so many variables that therefore to define when X or Y will break apart in timeline terms is very difficult to do.
And then just looking at the front lines of Ukraine, we're seeing reports of counterattacks and Ukraine gaining more land. Do you see a big offensive this summer?
I don't see it in a big offensive in terms of something being operationally significant, but I do see the greatest operational significance of being able to cut, if possible, the land route to Crimea. It was always the case for me, particularly in the failed counterattack in 2023, that if you could cut the route to Crimea, that was the theory of victory for Ukraine, because it's that which would allow them to say to the Russians and the Russian people to say to Putin, what is this war all about? There are only three ways why fighting stops: either by decisive military action, that is not looking likely for either side; secondly, by the improbability of military victory; or thirdly, because the costs have become too high for each side, either in demographic, social, economic terms. It is that Ukraine are trying to exacerbate, in the same way, of course, that Russia are trying to exacerbate that for Ukraine.